Hello, welcome to the 2021 Miami Valley Cycling Summit. We're your hosts, Laura Estandia of Bike Miami Valley
and Aidt of the City of Kettering. We're here to give you a quick introduction to the Cycling Summit hosted on Remo. Please fill out your profile so other attendees can contact you directly and know who you are. Now let's learn about navigating the event in what Remo calls conversation mode. When you enter the event space, you will join a table with the topic of your choice, where you can turn on your video and microphone to chat with others at your table. If you do not have a microphone or camera, you can use the chat feature on the bottom of your screen to chat your table directly. You can move to a different table by double-clicking on your mouse on that table. You can also visit other floors in the event space by selecting a floor on the left side of your screen. During the afternoon, you can double-click on the photos on the left side of your screen labeled Miami Valley Cycling Summit, Tracks 2 and 3 to join the afternoon session of your choice. View sponsor information and videos by clicking on their logos. Finally, you can always click the agenda item in the upper right corner of the screen to view the day's events.
Now let's talk about presentation mode. When the event host starts a session, you will have the ability to see the speakers and their presentations. In this mode, you can engage with the presentation in the chat on the right-hand side, view participants, and submit questions in the Q&A. If you should ever need help during the course of the event, please click the pink Need Help icon at the bottom left of your screen to chat with a Remo specialist. And there you have it, your quick introduction to the virtual Miami Valley Cycling Summit in Remo. Thank you for joining us and enjoy today's event.
Welcome to the 2021 Miami Valley Cycling Summit. My name is Andy Aidt, and I'm a proud City of Kettering employee and this year's Cycling Summit co-chair.
My name is Laura Estandia, and I am the Executive Director of Bike Miami Valley. For those of you new to the event, Bike Miami Valley's biennial cycling summit aims to use the power of cycling to drive economic development in communities both large and small throughout the region. This year's theme is Safe Streets for All. We've got a great day of programming ahead of us. But before we get started, we would like to thank any elected officials who have joined us today, as well as members of the board of Bike Miami Valley. Please give us a wave in the chat if you are here. Thank you for your service and your support of the cycling community.
At this time, we'd also like to recognize our sponsors. We could not host this free event without their generous support. I would first like to recognize our presenting sponsor and host, the City of Kettering. Our session sponsors, Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission, Greene County Parks and Trails, our hospitality sponsor, Miami County Parks, Friends of Cycling sponsors, Five Rivers Metro Parks, Young's Jersey Dairy, Heapy Engineering, supporting sponsors, Beaver Creek Parts and Trails, Choice One Engineering, City of Springfield, Dark County Parks, Dayton Convention and Visitors Bureau, Miami Conservancy District, Tool Design Group, Yellow Springer Teas and Promotions. Please join me in thanking them. They are the reason why we can keep this event free for all of you. We are so appreciative of their support.
Every other year, the Cycling Summit is hosted by a local community in the Miami Valley that dedicates almost 2 years of hard work to make this event come to life. As this year's host, the City of Kettering has managed the difficult task of planning a conference on the heels of a global pandemic. I want to recognize and thank the Planning Committee for all of their hard work during these uncertain times. I know Bike Miami Valley has enjoyed working with the planning team and hopes to continue growing the cycling culture in Kettering long after this event is over with our newly launched chapter, Cycle Kettering. In fact, I would like to remind you that this year's summit is a 2-day event. Please plan to join us again on Friday, May 14th from 12:30 to 3:30 p.m. as we conduct a socially distant tour of Kettering's bicycle assets and amenities. Please be sure to follow our newsletter over the next week for more information on this one-of-a-kind event. We will now transition to the awards portion of our event. Bike Miami Valley founded the Cycling Summit in 2009, and in 2015, we started our Advocacy Awards tradition, where we recognize an individual and an organization that is committed to making every day Bike to Work Day. They epitomize all of the environmental, social, and economic benefits of bicycling, and they activate decision makers to improve cycling in our community. We received many worthy nominations this year, and I'm thrilled to share our recipients. The individual advocate we plan to recognize this year has been an advocate for trail development in the region for more than 20 years. Through his work at the Miami Conservancy District, our recipient began meeting with leaders of cities along the Great Miami River to discuss recreational partnerships, promoting the vision of a connected trail through Miami, Montgomery, Warren, Shelby, and Butler counties following the river, primarily using MCD flood protection land. He sought, won, and managed grants totaling more than $3 million, including trail segments in Hamilton, Middletown, and Franklin. After 30 years at the district, he retired and turned to life as an advocate. He helped form the Regional Trails Committee that brings together Miami Valley trail managers who to this day meet, collaborate, and problem solve as a region bounded by one network. Last but not least, he set out to make the city of Springboro a bicycle-friendly community. Through his involvement in the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission's 2008 Regional Bikeway Plan, he was able to channel resources to kickstart increased bicycle planning and programming in Springboro and 9 other Miami Valley communities through follow-on consulting services in the form of action plans. In the case of Springboro, the action plan laid the groundwork for the creation of the city's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee in 2009, adoption of the Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan in 2013, and bicycle-friendly community status awarded in 2016. Our recipient is renowned as an advocate for helping communities see how their trail projects are part of something bigger, something that makes the region a better place, which is why we are pleased to recognize Hans Landelefd as this year's Advocate of the Year recipient.
Wow, it's truly an honor to receive this award. I was extremely surprised and amazed to learn that I was nominated, let alone chosen as the recipient. After all, I've been retired from full-time work for 11 years, and I'm no longer actively consulting or volunteering. However, I remain passionate about biking and making it as easy as possible to bike safely. We've built 350 miles of trails in the last 20 years. Can you believe it? I can't. Most of you know it isn't easy getting bike trails built. It takes a very, very long time. I was extremely fortunate that later in my career at the Miami Conservancy District, my role allowed me to help create something as permanent as recreation trails throughout the greater Miami Valley. I vividly recall an early learning experience. I had just received a $1.2 million federal transportation grant, and it's the first of that kind that I have ever gotten before. But I set up a meeting with ODOT to find out what to do next. I arrived a bit early and was directed to a conference room with a large table. I sat down, and a few minutes later, 12 people filed in, sat down, crossed their arms, and stared at me. Something told me this wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. Shortly after, the learning began as they started sharing advice while I furiously wrote down as much as I could. A noteworthy meeting a few years later was related to the development of trail signage. I represented MCD in a group that included people from Five Rivers Metro Parks, Miami County Parks, Centerville, Washington Township Parks, Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission, and Greene County Parks. The goal was to create uniform, intuitive signage and wayfinding for the trails. We debated for hours whether to use an informally suggested numbering system or request input from ODOT, ODNR, and county officials, or develop our own system. I basically said at that meeting, if we're ever going to get this done, we're going to have to leave those guys out of it and do it ourselves. And that's exactly what we did. We developed an easy-to-follow trail signage system and map system, later emulated by others in the state, including the Ohio to Erie Trail. As I neared retirement, I realized that Springboro, my home community, still had a long way to go to be more bike-friendly and pedestrian-friendly. And I spoke briefly at a Springboro council meeting to propose incorporating bike trails in their future plans. And I offered to help. Springboro's city manager, mayor, and city planner were all supportive, and the city formed the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. Its subsequent bike plan and trail improvements led to Springboro being recognized as a national bike-friendly community. I'm only one of many who saw the potential for a community and region where cyclists of all skill levels could commute and ride safely. It has taken a combination of national and state grants, local governments, community foundations, enthusiastic public employees, and citizen advocates to accomplish what's been done so far. There's always more to do, and I'm confident that those of you attending today will add more miles of lanes and trails in Ohio, and eventually connect to adjacent states. My Parkinson's disease has affected my balance, so I don't ride my bike anymore, but I still get a thrill when I see cyclists in a designated lane or on a trail, and it's extremely satisfying to me to think that I may have played a part in making that happen. Your recognition of my contribution means a lot to me. Thank you very much.
Congratulations again, Hans. At this time, I would like to introduce our Organizational Advocate of the Year. This year's award recipient has only been in existence a short while, but they have already made a big impact on our regional trail network. In its 4-year existence, the organization has worked continuously to drive economic activity and tourism along the Great Miami River Trail and the communities through which it travels. They have also encouraged completion of the existing gaps in the trail in Shelby, Warren, and Butler counties, with the goal of having all 99 miles of the river from Sidney to Hamilton accompanied by multi-use trail. The organization creates a unique space in which trail managing agencies participate in a tourism development program geared toward the river and trail corridor. Their involvement has spurred social media campaigns, as well as improving signage and wayfinding along the corridor to attract visitors. Their work has helped these trail managing agencies think beyond their infrastructure or conservation roles for a collective economic impact that can be felt up and down the river. They are placing significant emphasis on helping communities repurpose properties that have outlived their past life, such as the redevelopment of the former DP&L coal plant in Miamisburg that will be repurposed into a 200-acre mixed-use development, and a former paper plant in Hamilton that is transforming a paper plant built in 1893 to a $144 million youth sports facility on the banks of the Great Miami River. Therefore, we are pleased to recognize the Great Miami Riverway as this year's Organizational Advocate of the Year. I would now like to invite Dan Foley, the director of the Great Miami Riverway, to say a few words.
My name is Dan Foley. I'm the director of the Great Miami Riverway. On behalf of the Great Miami Riverway, we are so thankful to Bike Miami Valley for naming us the Organization of the Year. Bike Miami Valley and organizations like ours have worked together for years to build out the infrastructure for what is the greatest number of paved connected miles of bike path in the country. And that does a couple things. Number one, it allows people the opportunity to get outside, to lead healthier lives. And secondly, we think it leads to a quality of life and stronger economic development in our communities. We represent communities from Sidney to Hamilton to the Ohio River. And the Great Miami River Recreation Trail connects that, but we also connect to all of the other bike path miles that go east, west, north, and south. And so we're going to continue to work with Bike Miami Valley day in and day out to build that network, to make it stronger. And again, on behalf of the Great Miami Riverway, I just want to say thank you to Bike Miami Valley for this great honor. Thank you.
Congratulations, Dan, and everyone at the Great Miami Riverway. Finally, without further ado, I would like to invite Mayor Patterson to say a few words on behalf of the community of Kettering and introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, I'm Don Patterson. As the mayor of Kettering, Ohio, it is my honor and privilege to welcome you to the 2021 Cycling Summit. By now, we've grown accustomed to doing things a bit differently to respect local and state guidelines for health and safety. And on behalf of the city of Kettering, Bike Miami Valley, the presenters who have generously given of their time to share important information, the volunteers who help make this happen, and our community sponsors. Thank you for shifting gears to attend this important, engaging, and fun event. This year's theme is Safe Cycling for All. Content experts will detail how cycling can improve transportation, health, and economic vitality of the Miami Valley. Sessions will cover a variety of topics, including regional bikeways update, bike facility maintenance best practices, equity in planning and advocacy, and so much more. I am pleased to introduce Charles T. Brown, the keynote speaker for the 2021 Miami Valley Cycling Summit. Mr. Brown is a renowned street-level researcher who works at the intersection of transportation, health, and equity. He serves as a senior researcher with the Allen M. Voorhees Transportation Center, VTC, and an adjunct professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, both at Rutgers University. He has 17 years of public and private sector experience in urban and regional planning, public policy, and research. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Brown.
And Mayor, for that wonderful introduction. It is much appreciated. I would like to thank Laura, Andrew, Andy, Randy, Carl, and many others for having me here today. I would also like to thank today's sponsors and organizing committee members, as well as each and every one of you who are present here today for being here with us. I would like to also re-emphasize that if you have questions following my presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function. In fact, you can use it during the presentation. And don't forget to vote up the questions that you want prioritized during today's conversation. Again, my name is Charles T. Brown, and today I'm here to present to you Arrested Mobility, exploring the adverse social, political, economic, and health outcomes of over-policing Black, Indigenous, people of color mobility in the U.S. But before I do, I would like to first tell you a little more about me and sort of how I got to do the work that I'm doing. I identify as a street-level researcher and a pracademic, given my many years inside and outside of the academy, and the fact that I strongly believe that the answers to many of our problems, our societal problems, are found in the streets among the people. I was reared in a rural town in Mississippi of less than 500 people. And since that time, I've traveled and worked in communities of all sizes, ideologies, and cultures across the US. Some of those towns have been blue, some of those towns have been red, some green, and quite frankly, many have been confused. But in short, I want you to know that I do have 99 problems, but understanding and connecting with you isn't one of them. I live by the African proverb, I am because we are. Now, many of you will see my presentation today and ask the question, why focus on race and ethnicity within the context of cycling, particularly in your region? Well, I've chosen to prioritize the race conversation in my transportation equity work in order to broaden the narrative of transportation planning. See, I'm strongly committed to leading and centering race in all transportation decision-making processes because too often race is glazed over in planning, research, and policy development. And unfortunately, this makes assumptions about the communities we are tasked to serve. Instead, what you find are proxies such as income, age, sex, gender, education, and even access to vehicles are used as alternatives to avoid centering race-based issues. See, I strongly believe that we have a professional and a moral obligation to acknowledge that the uneven development of our cities and the resulting racial, health, and wealth disparities are the result of systemic racism ingrained within our professions as well as within our institutions and systems. It is our job, however, to reverse that. So what is equity? Well, first and foremost, equity then involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives. Equity is also the process or the presence of justice and fairness within the procedures, the processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. Most importantly, however, though, doing this equity work requires an understanding of the underlying or root causes of inequality and oppression within our society. See, equity isn't just a desktop exercise. It requires that you understand these root causes and that you get yourselves or remove yourselves from behind your computer and really connect with the people. It also requires, though, a consideration of the various social identities. And as you consider this discussion around the various social identities, I want you to ask yourself a series of questions, starting with, which identities do you think about most often? Which identities do you think about least often? Which of your own identities would you like to learn more about? And which of your identities have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself? And then lastly, which of your identities have the greatest effect on how others perceive you? See, this is important because the work that we're trying to do for many of us and what my presentation is getting at is not the seen, but the unseen. And to illustrate what is unseen, I want to share with you something that I share with my transportation class every other year at Rutgers. Here's a context for you. This is Newark, New Jersey. It's the 5th Ward of Newark, New Jersey, or the West Ward of Newark, New Jersey. And it is a predominantly African-American community, or let's say a minority community. And in my class, I have the planners, the engineers, the architects, etc., answer the question, which improvements would you make to this photo? I'm going to invite you in the chat to state which improvements you would make. Usually what you hear as you all queue up your responses is that people say, hey, we would like to see more trees or healthier trees. We would like to see pedestrian scale lighting. What about sidewalk repair? What about trash removal? What about maintenance and resurfacing of the roadway? How about some redevelopment or development efforts? Oh, we certainly need facade improvement. And then lastly, can we place those utilities underground? Oh, but most importantly, what about bike lanes? Well, in my classes, what we've discovered is that everyone says the same thing. And in workshops across the country, everyone also says the same thing. But what people fail to mention, however, is the most important thing. And that question is, where are the people? See, in this community, the West Ward of Newark, when we were doing this Complete Streets workshop for them, the people stated very frankly, please do not leave us out of your design. Because too often, people say, well, they don't want bicycle lanes. It's not the bicycle lane. It's the fact that when you do your before and after renderings, you have erased people out of the future. So what they're responding to isn't an adverse reaction to the bike lane. It's an adverse reaction to the fact that they may not be present in the future when that bike lane comes. See, why is this important? Because there are a plethora of federal, state, local initiatives, plans, policies, and programs aimed at increasing physical activity, as well as improving pedestrian and bicycle safety and mobility among all people throughout the U.S. These include Vision Zero, Complete Streets, Open Streets, Livable Streets, and even Safe Streets and Calm Streets. However, if we are being honest, what we find is that few, if any, of these programs ever achieve their goal of removing barriers to being more physically active or accessing equitable and inclusive pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure. The challenges with these initiatives are multiple. I would say, first and foremost, it is that the current descriptions of many of them are ahistorical and apolitical. This is particularly in regards to the history of systemic and institutional racism within the US. Next, we find that the strategies do not highlight the role of state and municipal law enforcement in discouraging and denying this mobility and physical activity among people of color. Thirdly, there are usually equitable and inclusive access variables listed as foundational elements, but not explicitly as a desired outcome or goal with a tangible organizational commitment to funding organizations that work with and in these minority communities. Fourthly, we find that there is no mention of the overwhelming data highlighting the magnitude of unconscious bias and even the criminalization of Blackness or otherness in America, particularly in light of the current climate. And then fifth, what we find is that the strategies do not specifically discuss the need for institutional changes, particularly around increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion, both internally as well as externally. See, in the health field, many have stated that these are social determinants of health. But if you've been in planning and advocacy long enough, you know that these are political determinants of health. And if they are political determinants of health, then we can create a political process to undo the harm that is done. But many of you are asking right now, what is arrested mobility, which is the heart of today's conversation? Well, arrested mobility is the assertion that Black people and other minorities have been historically and presently denied by legal and illegal authority the inalienable right to move, to be moved, or to simply exist in public space. This unfortunately results in adverse social, political, economic, and health effects that are widespread and intergenerational, but they are preventable. And so some of you may be asking at this moment, is there a framework around arrested mobility? Yes, there is a framework. And as shown here in this framework, arrested mobility is a direct manifestation of racism across four distinct realms of racism: the personal, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the cultural. These collective realms of racism have resulted in the social construct of race, locally and globally, and have thus led to the intentional and deliberate targeting and over-policing of Black and other minorities. This includes, unfortunately, their physical mobility, which has a direct connection to, and their social mobility, of which there is an indirect connection to. And for all my social scientists present here today, please understand that I do understand that the direct relationship shown between the variables here are much more complex and nuanced. And so then the question becomes next, how are Black people and other minorities over-policed? Well, over-policing is evident via three distinct forms. The first one is policy. Policy includes whether we're talking about zoning, racial residential segregation, or disinvestment. The second piece is around law enforcement, which is your more traditional form of over-policing. But this occurs at the federal, state, and local regions in terms of law enforcement participation. And then lastly, a growing awareness is around the self-deputization of white citizens, the quote unquote Karens throughout the country, who also restrict the movement of Black and brown parties as well. And one thing to keep in mind here in the context of the physical mobility, the various degrees of over-policing impact on mobility are evident and overwhelmingly supported by data across all the different modalities. This includes whether one is walking, biking, driving, taking public transit or private transit, hopping a ride via rideshare, or using a micromobility device such as a scooter. But this also happens, unfortunately, regardless of the race or the age, or whether you're riding your bicycle in a neighborhood as a 3-year-old or taking a ride on the neck of your father. See, again, it's important here today in this summit that you, all of you, understand how over-policing arrests the physical mobility of Black people in your region. This is of critical importance because we are together working as hard as we can to get more people to be physically active. But in order to do so, we must understand what prevents them from being active. So many of you will ask the question, is there evidence to support arrested mobility across the different modes of transportation? Well, let's first start with walking. In the context of walking, the most recent and notable cases of over-policing Black mobility via walking or running in the US includes the shooting deaths and murder of Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging, Trayvon Martin, who was walking, and Mike Brown, who was also walking. Both Ahmaud and Trayvon were murdered by self-deputized non-Black citizens, and Mike Brown was murdered by law enforcement. But you may be asking, okay, what does the data reveal? Well, an analysis of 5 years of tickets issued to pedestrians in Jacksonville, Florida, revealed that 55% of the tickets were issued to Blacks, even though only 29% of the population identify as Black. In that same study, they found that Blacks were 3 times more likely to receive a ticket than whites, and residents of the city's 3 poorest zip codes were about 6 times as likely to receive a pedestrian citation as those living in the city's other more affluent 34 zip codes. And then I want to pause here for a second to give you the opportunity to Google Raquel Nelson. Do yourself a favor and do me a favor and Google Raquel Nelson. Now that's walking, and in the context of arrested mobility, I wish it ended with walking. Unfortunately, it does not. It also happens in public transit. And in the case of public transit, one of the most recent cases there is that of Oscar Grant III, who was a 22-year-old Black man who was killed by or murdered by BART police officers in Oakland, California. But what does the data say, you may ask? Well, a Marshall Project analysis of the New York Division of Criminal Justice Service data from 2014 showed that while the number of turnstile arrests have decreased significantly, what has not changed is who gets arrested. 89% of those arrested each year are Black or Hispanic. Also, what we find is that while adjusting for the subway swipes, or traffic I meant, the top 10 neighborhoods in New York with the highest number of arrests per subway swipe were all predominantly Black or Hispanic. And what I would like for you to do right now is Google Adrian Napier. Adrian was a Black teenager who was tackled and aimed at by 10 police officers for fare evasion. That fare was only $2.75. Yes, only $2.75. In 2017, Blacks were 8 times more likely than whites to be charged for certain transit violations in Portland, Oregon. Thankfully, Portland took the lead and decriminalized that activity, I think, in 2018. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended with public transit. Unfortunately, it does not. It also goes into driving, and what we find is that the most recent and notable cases of over-policing Black mobility via driving in the US includes the murders of Philando Castile and Sandra Bland. And for many of you here today representing the Dayton region, you know too, you've had a plethora of studies that have proven police bias in traffic enforcement in your area as well. But we'll get to that in the Q&A. So what does the data say outside of your region? Well, a national or a nationwide quantitative analysis of policing trends in traffic stops showed that Blacks and Hispanic drivers are stopped disproportionately to white drivers, even though the hit rate of white and Black drivers are similar. Unsurprisingly, what was found is that police are less likely to pull over Black drivers at the dusk when the race of the driver is less obvious to police. Taking us to Minnesota, which has been the center of a lot of discussions as of late, especially around policing and the enforcement of Black and brown bodies, a state commission study in Minnesota found that Blacks and Latinos were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police in white majority neighborhoods. And in 2016, 47% of the arrests by St. Anthony Police Department in Minnesota were of Black individuals, even though the patrolled area is only about 7% Black. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended there. Unfortunately, it does not. It is also present in ride sharing. And one of the most notable studies about ride sharing included researchers from Stanford, MIT, and the University of Washington, who all found that ride share drivers discriminate based on race and gender. What does the data show? Well, of the 581 app-hailing trips recorded, Black travelers waited on average 20% longer than white travelers to have their ride accepted on Lyft and Uber. And female travelers were driven 5% further than males, given the same start and finish location. And I can attest to this last point. 55% of the Blacks who have called for a cab at some point have experienced a refusal by the service to send a cab to their community. But in the case of arrested mobility, I wish it ended with ride sharing. However, it does not. It also includes the cases of Breonna Taylor and Tamir Rice, both who were killed innocently while going about normal activities. And that's about as much I'll say there. But in the case of arrested mobility, and the reason why we're here today, many of you may be asking the question, what does this have to do with cycling? This, my friends, has everything to do with cycling, because people's mobility are being arrested regardless of the mode. And in the context of cycling, there are more than a dozen studies now and reports on over-policing Black mobility via cycling in the US. It is happening within your region, it's happening in my region, it's happening all over the US. I know because I've authored a number of articles on this issue, but one of the most recent and notable studies of it included a study done by the Chicago Tribune, which found that not a single majority white area ranked in the top 10 for bicycle tickets, despite biking's popularity in white areas such as Westtown and Lincoln Park. Other studies I'll go over briefly here out of Tampa and Oakland. And then one that I would recommend you all take a look at is a more recent one done by Bicycling Magazine. But what does the data say here? Well, let's first go to Tampa. Between 2003 and 2015, Tampa police issued over 10,000 bicycle tickets. 79% of those tickets were issued to Blacks, even though their population is only 26% Black. Now let's go to Oakland. in Oakland, California, 60% of all bicycle stops between 2016 and 2017 included Black cyclists, though the city of Oakland's population is only 25% Black. And going back to Tampa, during that 12-year study period, of those 10,000 bicycle tickets, at least 142 bicycle tickets were issued to kids aged 15 and under. This, unfortunately, included children as young as 3 years old. Now, moving back to Oakland, what we found is that twice as many bicycle citations, I meant not Oakland, Chicago, excuse me. In Chicago, twice as many bicycle citations are written in majority Black neighborhoods than in majority white or Latino neighborhoods. In fact, the data showed that 321 bicycle tickets were issued in Austin, a low-income majority Black community in Chicago, whereas only 5% were issued in Lincoln Park, a wealthy majority white community in Chicago. Why should this surprise anyone? Well, if you've ever been to Chicago, you know you're much more likely to see a white cyclist than any other cyclist. This shows a pattern of structural discrimination, racism, and bias. The question, though, that we all have to wrestle with is one, what will we do about it collectively? But before you answer that question, I want you to understand that there are adverse social, political, and economic outcomes that must be considered and addressed. And so you may ask, what are they? Well, first and foremost, Blacks are 54% less likely to be physically active as a result. This includes or is regardless of their neighborhood or income level or the racial composition of a neighborhood. It's also true that Black men attempt to make themselves seem less threatening. So think about the psychology behind the fact that, or the decisions you have to make even before leaving your home. We also find that areas with larger Black population tend to have lower rates of upward mobility. Remember, I stated that one's physical mobility is connected to one's upward mobility. We then find that residential segregation has led to this dearth of hospitals and healthcare providers in these areas, and Blacks are paying about twice as much as their average household income for health costs. Think about the Dayton region and how segregated it is because of race, and then think about your aim to increase or make it more equitable and inclusive in the ways in which that segregation might impact it. Then we find that these heavily Black areas are disproportionately associated with food deserts, made even worse by a lack of access to transportation options. So this makes the case as to why it's important to have bike share, to have bike stations, bike lanes, protected bike lanes, lighting, etc. in these areas so that we can ensure that people gain access to food security. And then lastly, the reason why this is political in nature too is because transportation disadvantage also makes people vulnerable to disenfranchisement efforts like a lower density of polling places, which then exacerbates the lack of representation in government. So some of you may be asking the big question, the question of all questions. Okay, we get it now, but how can we, yes, the collective we, create a safe, equitable, and inclusive system for all? What I'll do in the next 10 to 12 minutes here is walk you through first a justice framework you can use to help you make decisions. I'll give you some internal practices you could use to change your culture. And then I will end with a list of action items that you could take today to change things in your region. Let's start with the justice framework. In this justice framework, I'll talk about distributive justice, procedural justice, interactional justice, representational justice, and then lastly, care. Starting with distributive justice, when it comes to making sure things are more equitable and inclusive, the first thing you want to consider is distributive justice. And distributive justice forces you to ask the question, who has physical access to that street, to that park, or to that trail? This is important because my research has shown that most of the respondents in the survey I did, many of whom were Black and brown, do not feel that their children are safe when bicycling in their neighborhoods. That less than 1 in 4 feel that they can even safely bicycle to local parks and trails. See, what this shows is that in these communities, proximity isn't access. There's a social political dynamic that one must consider beyond the physical distance between one location and another. That is distributive justice. The next thing one must consider, though, is procedural justice. Who has influence over the design, the operations, and the programming of a space? Because my work has shown me that too often, unfortunately, minority youth are not included in planning and transportation decision-making processes, which leads us to the next form of justice, interactional justice. What makes people feel welcomed or unwanted in a space? This is of importance. African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. So if you don't address the issue of over-policing, you can have a bicycle-friendly city. It just won't be bicycle-friendly for everyone. And when it comes to the gender dynamics here, or the sexual orientation dynamics here, we find that males reported being stopped at a rate 7 times that of females, and then too often the fatal violence against transgender and gender non-conforming communities go unreported or misreported in transportation and mobility discussions. I would like to pause for a second and ask you, how often have you heard the words transgender or gender non-conforming during this summer? Moving on, that takes us to the need for representational justice. Do people feel their experience and history is represented in the space? This becomes increasingly important because you need to think about how often historical and cultural erasure takes place in communities across the country. And then lastly, how do people demonstrate their care for the spaces that we create, but also other people in it? Because if we're honest, we know that our transportation, our advocacy around bike planning, pedestrian planning, et cetera, are biased against women and certainly do not protect in the ways it should religious minority groups. That takes us to the importance of a cultural shift, an internal culture shift, which leads us to centering equity in all of our processes. The first thing that you must do as an institution is adopt anti-racist values and cultures. Second thing you must do is create a racial equity action plan to show that you are serious as it relates to equity. But notice that I emphasize the importance of racial equity. Being explicit here is important. Also, take your staff and yourselves through a series of equity trainings, develop equity performance measures, develop an internal equity group, and then lastly, to hold you accountable, be sure to develop an external equity advisory group. And I know the Ohio region can do it. Why? Because Utah did it. And if Utah can do it, anyone can do it. And I laugh because Utah, those are my friends, but we all know that Utah is one of the less diverse states in all of America. But if they can focus on the importance of systemic racism, so can you. That leads to now the strategies that you can use to center equity. We're going to talk about racial equity, modal equity, procedural equity, language equity, gender equity, spatial equity, and my last but favorite of all, common sense. So what are these actions? At this point, you may want to take out your phone because I'll quickly go through these so that we can have time for Q&A. The first action goes back to the importance of committing yourselves through the adoption of a racial equity action plan. If organizations such as Boeing, if Cal, Trans, and other larger institutions could do it, so can you. Action number one, commit to equity through the adoption of a racial equity action plan. Action number two, prioritize investments and maintenance in minority and low-income communities via bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure and maintenance. It's not enough to build it and abandon it. You must build it and maintain it. Action three, ensure the full and fair participation of racialized minority groups. The DOT guiding EJ principles state that we must ensure the full and fair participation. And this is so that we can avoid, mitigate, and minimize disproportionately high and adverse human health and environmental effects, including the social and economic effects on these minority and low-income populations. So action three, ensure that. Action four is about fostering more equitable treatment of diverse languages in the public sphere. All of our cities are becoming more diverse. One way to help people feel like they belong is to ensure language equity and access as well as literacy. Action five, document and increase mobility and access for the elderly and persons with disabilities. And as we do so, please don't just focus on those with physical disabilities, focus too on those with cognitive disabilities and otherwise. Action six, engage with women in female-headed households to understand their unique differences and behaviors in use of our bicycle facilities. Because if you go into the streets, you find that they perceive and utilize and relate to the infrastructure in a way that's much different than males. So please engage with them. And while doing so, engage with our foreign-born populations who too, due to cultural reasons, engage with these and utilize these systems in a much more different way than the status quo. Action 8, evaluate and mitigate the unintended consequences of improved mobility and access. You know, if you build it, gentrification will come. So what is stopping you from proactively working against these unintended consequences? Because too often what we find is that trees planted in minority communities mature just in time for gentrification to take place. Then action number 9, analyze the impact of past and current zoning and land use decisions. If you are one of the people that believe in this idea of structural or institutional racism, then you may also believe, as many have stated, that zoning and land use is one of its first tools. Action 10, safeguard against discriminatory enforcement. I strongly believe that it is imperative that we all work together as a community, law enforcement and all, to figure out a way to ensure that this discriminatory enforcement, this sort of racial bias in traffic safety, bicycle safety, et cetera, ends. Action 10, we must work against and challenge and eliminate the scary Black male narrative. If not, too many of our young Black males will continue to be jailed, killed, or incapacitated as a result of this fear. I've stated how 2.5 times more likely they are to be killed by law enforcement. I don't know if I need to say more than that, but that's the action we must take. Action 11, we need to collect and analyze disaggregated data on Black lives and experiences, because too often we report data in the aggregate form, which normalizes the experiences of those who are oppressed. Action 13, let's advocate for the penalization of race-based 911 calls. This gets at the self-deputization of white citizens and their need and desire to control and restrict the mobility of Black and brown people in your region. Again, this unfortunately leads to harm against Black and brown bodies in your area. Action 14, organize efforts to decriminalize jaywalking across the country. yes, there's a connection between jaywalking and bicycling, because as you all know, one should dismount when crossing at an intersection. Action 15, we must also organize efforts to decriminalize bicycling in low-income and minority communities. Reason being is because too often riding on sidewalks, failure to have proper lights or reflectors, failure to use or ride within available bicycle lanes, failure to obey a traffic control device, all of these are being used as a pretext to discriminate, to arrest, to assault, to harm not only cyclists, but also their families as well. And then as a bonus, please challenge what it means to be a bicycle friendly community in a strong town. Because when you have a community that is deemed a bicycle friendly or a strong town, and the Black, brown, and low income parts of that community lack access to that safe, equitable, and inclusive infrastructure, those programs and those initiatives that those communities are rewarded for or awarded for, what sign or signal are you sending to those people? It seems as if we don't care. So we have to challenge this notion of what is bicycle friendly. Again, if it's not friendly for everyone, it's not friendly. See, because for every Portland, there's an East Portland. For every Hoboken, New Jersey, there's a Camden, New Jersey. For every Orlando, there's a Tampa. For every Manhattan, there's a Bronx. And for every Chicago, there's a South Side of Chicago. And this is all important because many of you have stated, we get it, we're in this together. We are, but we're not in the same boat. We're just in the same storm. There is a huge, huge difference. And the difference is best illustrated by the voices of those on Twitter who say Blacks and other minorities are so tired. They can't go jogging, they can't go biking, they can't walk home with Skittles, they can't get a normal traffic ticket, they can't have a disabled vehicle, they can't run, they can't breathe, they can't live. Their mobility has been arrested. I would like to thank you for your time. I'm putting together a podcast, the Arrested Mobility Podcast, which is going to be a narrative-based podcast, which goes deeply into these thematic issues. I've also put together an Arrested Mobility Book Club to help many of you learn with me the ways in which we can address these issues. To date, over 250 professionals from around the world have signed up, and I'm doing many, many other things to ensure that we reverse the policies that restrict the mobility of all of our people. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me, and I look forward to staying in touch with each of you. Again, thanks to the dynamic team, the organizing team, the sponsors, etc. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Charles. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. I think we all are going to be able to take away something from that presentation that'll help us do our jobs better in the Miami Valley region.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah. The first question we have on the list, the one that has the most votes, probably because it's been on the Q&A section for a while now, is how do we get more people on bikes?
Well, I think I just gave you about 15 ways to get more people on bike, but let me answer that much more directly. Policy. We need to, again, address any policies that disproportionately target racialized minority groups in your region. We need to remove laws that are in place, such as bicycle helmet laws, bicycle license laws that restrict access to cycling in your region. Another thing we need is infrastructure investments in low-income communities. Think about how segregated Dayton is, and the fact that 40+% of your population is minority, but they lack access to the safe, equitable, and inclusive infrastructure than their counterparts. What if we invested a significant portion of the resources into that community to ensure that everyone had quality infrastructure? I strongly believe that will lead to more people biking. However, they will only bike for so long if they're going to be over-policed, which is why one must deal with this issue of arrested mobility. So work with law enforcement to ensure that the targeting discontinues so that everyone feels that they can safely bike to and from the areas that they need to go to, or should I say cross the river.
Yeah. One of the questions that I had concerning that issue is we talk a lot with our engineers, and as they're designing our bike facilities, it always seems like they want to separate the types of transportation. And how do we talk to them to get them to understand that maybe we don't need to separate all of it? Maybe there needs to be better understanding, better education, a different viewpoint to allow people to feel more comfortable taking other forms of transportation, and then the, kind of overarching to get more people to use other forms of transportation besides their cars.
Yeah, so one issue with many of our engineers across this country, and this is not just true of engineers, but this is true of cities in general, is there exists a certain degree of insecurity. And what I mean by that is their failure to want to learn from other cities that are putting forth best practices in bicycle design and access. For instance, if you're in, a part of this country, you can't say, let's look at another part of the country. You all would know best which state Ohio would not want to be compared to. But I'll give you an example here. If you're in New Jersey, you can't say, let's do as New York or let's do as Pennsylvania. But New York and Pennsylvania is much more advanced. And so this addresses the insecurity, the lack of continual learning among the engineering professions by sticking to what they've learned in college, as opposed to learning what other best practices are happening, not only throughout the region, but throughout the country and throughout the world. The other thing I would say is that we must remember that many engineers are drivers first. So what I found is that many people who design our streets have not ridden bicycles on our streets. There's a mismatch between their experience, their education, and their knowledge and awareness around bicycle issues because they have not experienced it to that degree. So they too become auto-centric and prioritize the automobile then over that of all other modes, adding more risk as opposed to reward. And that reward would lead to more people biking.
I think that's one of the things that Kettering has done over the past few years is we actually go out with the engineers and tour around the city on our bicycles. And it's a completely different perspective for them than going out and driving around. You
Absolutely.
Really get to notice the infrastructure in a much different way.
That bicycle eye view is much different, huh?
Yeah. Okay, second question is, how do you counter the attitude, quote, my people, in quotes, my people don't ride bikes?
Depends on which people we're talking about.
Well, I think it's whatever the group is, right? Yeah.
No, I get it. First of all, as a person that deals with statistics, if I'm hearing that from one person, while I respect it, it doesn't mean it's true. And so my research hasn't shown me that the majority of people are saying, my people don't ride bikes. But when I do get the statement, my people don't ride bikes, is usually followed by, because we don't have a safe place to ride bikes. We don't have access to quality bikes. We don't have bike shops in our communities. It is unsafe to ride at night because we don't have proper lighting. We are over-policed when we do ride. And for the women that choose to ride, we are harassed, we are sexually assaulted, etc. So it becomes, in our opinion, dangerous to ride. So it's not just a matter of choosing not to ride, it's because the conditions are not conducive to riding. And it's our job to ensure that all conditions are conducive in all communities.
All right. Yeah, I think that's true in most places. And I know that we always talk about minority, low income, women, all the groups that we typically don't see out riding, and how we get more of those people out on bikes.
Let me say one other thing to that, Andy. I would encourage the participants here, if they're on Facebook, to go to I think it's Black Cyclists Facebook group. There you'll see tens of thousands of bicyclists who are people of color from around the country. They are bicycling, but because our communities are segregated and because people fear potentially riding through a white area, if you identify as white, you may not see them for that reason. Yeah. I also know, because I'm a Peloton user, and this is certainly not a shout out to Peloton because they're not paying me, but their community is also large. Over 14,000 Black people are part of the Black Peloton group. So they are cycling, but when they're not cycling, it's because they fear for their lives in those communities.
Good point. Thank you. All right, next question. Where is it done right? That is, what localities have statistics that are in line with expectations? Anywhere?
Yes, I mean, there are examples of, I would say we're getting closer to what we would consider quote unquote right. If there was a grade card that was being issued, no one would receive an A at this point. But in terms of, your B minuses to your B pluses, I would probably add New York City there, given the chaos that it is and the ways in which it's been able to allocate space for cyclists. I would say Portland, Oregon is high on that list. Seattle, Washington. I would go down south to places like Washington, D.C. I think Chicago is doing a great job. And there are many others that I just can't think of, but no one right now is an A+ or a platinum, as our bicycle-friendly applications denote them.
Do you know if any of those people, any of those cities have changed the things that you've suggested here? Have they changed their helmet laws, changed their riding a bike on a sidewalk law, those kind of things?
I think some of that is happening. I don't know the specificity around which cities have done what. I know in out west, there are some conversations happening around bike helmet laws. And I want to be clear here in this conversation. I'm a cyclist. I'm an LCI. I ride my bike. I believe we all should wear helmets. I just don't think we should be criminalized for not wearing one. So that's the key distinction here. I don't want to see people thrown in jail or being fined an exorbitant amount because they lack a helmet. So those are some places. But I hesitate, Andy, to say those places because of my last point. Right. Those places could be bicycle friendly, but not be bicycle friendly for racialized minority groups and low income populations. And those cities understand that they need to do more. And what they have done that is different from other cities with that reality is that they're starting to prioritize equity and inclusion within their transportation decision-making processes.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, to continue that conversation, the next question here is, we often find here and around the US that minor traffic offenses are used to justify stops by police. What advice would you have for policymakers looking to change their local ordinances?
Well, again, decriminalize biking, decriminalize jaywalking. If you Google me with jaywalking, you'll find that I've been working with advocates across the country, in Kansas City, in Los Angeles, in the state of Virginia, now down in Texas and other places to address jaywalking laws and policies. When it comes to biking, I'm creating a community of practice where we're going to be decriminalizing biking by addressing the laws that lead to people being arrested. I think what you could do is to continue to research the places that have had some momentum, take those policies to your policy makers and, see what the pulse is around whether or not it's feasible in your location. But don't stop there, because there's a movement at the national scale to do just that. Lastly, I would say, given what has happened in, I think, Berkeley, they have taken law enforcement away from monitoring and responding to these minor issues, and instead are using I think like quote unquote code enforcement officers to address these. And other places like in Denver are using, I think, social workers. So there are a lot of innovative things happening that don't necessarily involve solely law enforcement.
All right, thank you.
And Andy, let me say this last thing. I'm not anti-law enforcement. Again, I am anti-criminalizing mobility when there are other ways in which we can address this.
Yeah, I think we definitely need to have them in the room when we're talking about this so that we can do it in the right way. Correct. All right, next question. How do we involve youth, minority or otherwise, in our decision-making planning processes?
Well, when it comes to minority youth, I think interacting with organizations of whom they trust so that you can have access to them. I think engaging them in internships, and I want to emphasize paid internships, so that they can be made aware of the ways in which transportation planning and policy impact their communities. I would love to see, there are many historically Black colleges and universities, some of you partnering with them to also target minorities and youth, to expose them to planning and engineers will be fruitful as well. So those are some ways to make it happen.
Okay. Yeah, I keep selling the fact that people can be on a committee to help a city plan for their alternative forms of transportation, and that could be a resume builder for their college applications for a high school student. Use it, try to sell that to see if we can get.
Yeah, and then lastly on that, I think there's a lot of advocacy groups here. Why not create a youth advocacy group made up of minority students?
It's a great idea. All right. All right, next question. Have you found success in engaging with local law enforcement and/or engineers in cases where the initial response was defensiveness or putting up walls?
Yes, the initial response for most people is always defensiveness when you're trying to change culture. I still think that we owe it to law enforcement and to ourselves to still have the conversation. I believe in sitting at the table with people, regardless of whether we have the same opinion or not, to find a common theme, common interest, and then work first alongside those common interests to then address more difficult things, things of which we disagree with. So yes, I've had a great deal of success there because, one, you must approach those situations with humility, empathy, and understanding. And I understand how difficult the job is for law enforcement because I'm ex-military. But at the same time, I want them to see how important it is for them to ensure equitable and inclusive access for all. So lead with your heart, lead with love, lead with respect for persons.
I've heard the comment, change the law and I'll enforce it.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, thank you. All right, next question. There needs to be more support nationally to institute bail justice reform, ensuring nonviolent offenders don't languish in jail for low-level offenses like bicycle violations. What comments do you have about that comment?
Comment is, I agree. I agree 100%. I think it's either New Jersey or Maryland. They have a really great model for preventing people from being in jail for minor offenses for a long time. So don't quote me on that, but it's either Maryland or New Jersey. Look those up, and I think they are a good model for the rest of the country.
Okay, good, thank you. Next question, what advice do you have for minority professionals working in the transportation planning and engineering space?
Be unapologetically you, because this space needs you to bring your experience to it, and you'll find that when you're you, you're most free and you're most impactful. What we don't need is for you to enter the space, assimilate into it, and then think that you have to model the behavior, you have to develop research questions, or develop policies that are similar to your white counterparts. My advice to you is to stand on your square, be you, be proud to be you, and bring that needed conversation to that space.
I agree. Okay, last question we have here is, do you think multi-hour virtual reality and AR training for law enforcement would help to adjust attitudes of law enforcement?
Yes and no.
Have you seen any of those?
I don't think it's the software that's going to do it. I think there has to be a culture shift with inside law enforcement. This is a systemic issue, not a matter of a lack of or a need for additional software or hardware. I do love VR, and I like this idea. I've trained law enforcement around addressing the stop and stay stop law in New Jersey. And again, I find law enforcement to be, great people, but there's a structural and an institutional problem that we must address. And if VR can help us address that issue, I'm all for it. But there's no magic bullet there in terms of technologies that will do so.
Okay. One comment here was that they would like you to put your final slide back up on the screen with your contact information.
I'll
and
do
then
it better by typing it here in the chat.
Okay. And then also, will your slide deck be available for us?
I think everyone's going to see the video. That's about the extent of what they'll see. Yeah.
We will have this video available on the Bike Miami Valley site once we get done with the conference.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions from anybody?
Let them know they can ask any and all questions.
Yeah, everything's open, right?
Everything's open.
Questions. Yep. So I'm not looking at the chat, but hopefully everybody if there's any questions in the chat, I see a lot of thank yous and well done, Charles. I would echo that. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you helping us through this. We appreciate your presentation. And agreeing to present, I guess, would be the first thing. But it's great to have you.
Yeah, I want to say it's been an absolute pleasure. You, Laura, Carl, the whole team has just been phenomenal. It's been a pleasure, getting to know you all during this time. I don't want to become a stranger. Feel free, as you're going about addressing these issues, to reach out to me at any time to assist you, and I'll be happy to do so.
Okay, we did get one more question, if you don't mind.
All right, let's see what it is. I don't mind at all.
All right, what might a community do first or have the most impact to make itself more equitable for cycling?
Infrastructure, protected bicycle lanes. If you can get protected bicycle lanes in your community, that's the #1 thing you could do to make it more equitable.
Yeah, I like to say that I'd like to design for a 5th grader. And if a 5th grader feels comfortable riding on the facilities you're designing, then you're successful.
Oh, how should we, as a majority culture, empower local major tailored cycling club? Great question. The first thing you could do is not seek to empower because they're already powered. What you could do is co-power with them. So this is about collaboration. This is about partnerships. This is about access to information and resources. So humility when addressing major tailored cycling club, again, speaking about co-empowerment as opposed to empowerment will go a long ways. And then be ready to accept the fact that they may not even want or need your help.
True.
And that's okay.
Yeah. Again, thank you, Charles, so much. We really appreciate it, and we will hopefully stay in touch with you and work together to make bicycling more inclusive.
Thank you, Andy. I can't wait to see you on a ride someday. You take care.
That'd be awesome. All right, you too.
Bye-bye.